we assessed in the this assessment report. And for giving me the opportunity to take part in this very important conversation. It reminds me back to '92, when you and me and I, we were together trying to facilitate the elaboration of a climate convention for civil society organization at Flamingo Park in Rio de Janeiro. Thank you. So let me just highlight some of the key takeaway messages of this very important report of IPCC. The first one is that, and then that is where we are not on track and then to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. As you know, that has been very well documented in the report. The average annual greenhouse gas emission during 2010 and 2019 were the highest in the history of human history. Emissions in 2019 of 59 gigaton of CO2 equivalent are about 12% higher than they were in 2010 and 54% higher than in 1990. CO2 emission from existing and planned fossil fuel infrastructure alone exceed the cumulative CO2 emissions consistent with limiting warming to 1.5 Celsius. And the global emissions are unequal, and this is very important. This is that has also been very well documented in the report. Households with income in the top 10% contribute 36–45% of greenhouse gas emissions, while those with incomes in the bottom 50% contribute to 15%. The majority of the lower 50% of emitters live in Africa, Southern and Southeast Asia, Latin America, Caribbean, most without access to electricity and or clean cooking services. And about 2/3 of the 10% live in developed countries. And without strengthening policies that have been implemented by the end of 2020, greenhouse gas emissions are projected to rise beyond the 2025, leading to average global warming of 3.2 degrees Celsius by 2100. And the average, we have seen also in the period that the average rate of, this is a good news of what we can, where we are. And then the growth in emission have slowed down, at least in the last decade. And then from during 2010 and 2019, the rate of growth, particularly on energy and industrial sector, have decreased while the transport remain the same. This is a good news. And then the second message that the report indicated is that there is increased evidence of climate action. Action is happening in different parts. And some countries have achieved sustained greenhouse gas emission reduction for longer than 10 years. And then the sustained decrease of up to 85% of solar and wind, and associated with range of policies and law, and then have enhanced the deployment of renewable energy. And this is very good news. And energy efficiency also, we have seen the increase of energy efficiency, and then we have seen also the reduction of rate of deforestation. And then the third message is that there are options available now in all sectors that can at least halve emissions by 2030. And then those are very well documented. My colleagues will go to details on that, from the energy sector to demand side, through the cities and other urban areas, in the building sector, in industry, in transport, agriculture, forestry, and other land uses. All over the world, there is an indication of available options, and then that can be enhanced, that can be increased if there is adequate policies, law, and finance. And the fourth main important takeaway message from this report is that the next few years will be critical, but there are ways to improve our chance of success if we have to make our ambition answer our ambition, because in all countries, effort to limit global warming that provide wider benefit to society can increase the pace, the depth, and the breadth of emission reductions. Explicit attention to equity is essential if we want policies that tackle climate change to be effective and socially acceptable. And social equity in terms of reinforces capacity and then to reduction of emissions. Accelerated international finance cooperation is critical and then to achieving low emission and just transition, and can address inequities in access to finance and the cost of and vulnerability to the impact of climate change. And the fifth takeaway message important is that unless there are immediate and deep greenhouse gas emissions reductions across all sectors in all countries, 1.5 degrees Celsius is beyond reach. And the last, not least, takeaway message is that accelerated climate action is critical to sustainable development. It's very well documented in the report that human-induced climate change is the result of more than a century of unsustainable energy and land use, lifestyles, and pattern of consumption and production. Climate change increasingly threatens the health and livelihood of people around the world and result in severe impacts in nature. And we also have to have in mind that in all countries, mitigation effort is embedded within the wider development context, increase the pace and all those different tasks. And then we also, the report documented also that the current development path may create behavior, spatial, economic, and social barriers to accelerate mitigation in all scale. Each of the country from its development stage, we have to integrate is very important, and then how we make that development more sustainable and compatible with climate. Being from the LDC or being from a highly industrialized country or emerging economy, the development need to move toward a more sustainable path, and then that is compatible with climate concerns. And then so that some of the elements I just wanted to highlight in order for my colleagues to go through in more details, and throughout the conversation be able to elaborate on some of those. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to have that highlight. Back to you, Navroz.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, I've just turned it on. Thank you so much, Yuba. Very, very grateful to have you with us. And thank you for this comprehensive but very succinct tour of the whole report that gives us the high-level story that, as you say, we can now delve into further, and particularly look forward to picking up some of the themes around the linkage with sustainable development for the audience we have here and globally, as well as many other themes from what you mentioned. Can I now turn to Keywan? Keywan, I believe you have some slides, and maybe you can take us through what some of the quantitative scenario analysis tells us about the where we could be headed.
Yeah, thank you, Navroz, for first of all inviting me here. It's really a pleasure to present some of the insights, particularly from chapter 3, some also from chapter 4. I've been the the coordinating lead author, that's how it's called nowadays, the coordinating lead authors of the chapter that looked into long-term emissions pathways. we basically assessed a very wide literature, roughly around 3,000 scenarios, which look into the issue of what it takes, how we can reduce emissions, and what do we need to do in order to limit temperature change to non-dangerous levels. So let me try to perhaps share my screen. So I hope you can see the presentation mode right now. Very good. So I would say the two main overarching conclusions from the scenario analysis are at the one hand that we are on a branching point. The actions over the next 8 years up to 2030 will be decisive about what long-term targets will be attainable, will be feasible. And as Yuba Sukona already indicated earlier, unless there is immediate and deep emission, unless there are immediate and deep emissions reductions across all the sectors, the 1.5 degree temperature target, temperature change, warming target will be beyond reach. So let me show you perhaps a few illustrations how we derive to that conclusion. First of all, the assessment starts with exploring alternative scenarios, and we looked into different future scenarios that basically implement current policies. Where do emissions end up in the long term in case no additional policies compared to those that are in place today are implemented? And this is the red band that you can see up there. Our assessment is that temperature change will be above 3 degrees if we follow the implemented policy paths into the future. These other pathways down here show you consistent emissions ranges and reductions that are necessary by the year 2050 in order to keep temperature at different levels. And if you want to keep temperature basically below, or we want to limit temperature to about 1.5 degrees, then our assessment shows that global greenhouse gas emissions need to peak before 2025. Basically, we need to halt emissions now, and we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 40% or 43% by 2030. And that's shown here with the light blue lines here. If you want to achieve 2 degrees warming, and the Paris Agreement refers to both well below 2 degrees and trying to reach 1.5 degrees, then still emissions would need to peak before 2025, basically over the next 3 years, and emissions would need to be reduced by 27% by 2030. And this is what you can see here with the green shaded areas and the scenarios. These are the scenarios that are likely to limit warming to 2 degrees. Now, current pledges by different countries in the international policy process, the so-called nationally determined contributions, they define basically country proposals for reductions by the year 2030, and we assessed in the report what those so-called NDCs would correspond to, and we find that the current proposals by countries to reduce emissions by 2030 are by far too weak and inconsistent with the long-term targets. So basically, if we would follow the current country proposals, then limiting warming to 1.5 degrees will be out of reach in the next 8 years. This is the point. These are roughly the NDCs in 2030. And also the 2 degree pathway will become significantly more challenging if we wait and follow the NDCs of the countries by 2030, and costs of reaching those targets would go up as well. And this is, I think, very clearly visible here if you consider that the current country proposal ends up somewhere here, and the cost-effective pathways to get to 2 degrees are here. You need to have, after 2030, a massive acceleration to keep 2 degrees still within reach. So challenges increases and costs would increase as well. Then the report shows quite elaborately that we need to reach net zero CO2 emissions in order to halt climate change. And if you want to limit temperature to 1.5 degrees, we need to do this by 2050. If you want to do this for 2 degrees, we have a little bit more time. We can globally reach net zero CO2 emissions by 2070 or early 2070s. And the different pathways that have been explored or assessed within the report show alternative ways how to do this. So this bar here shows you the emissions of different sectors in 2019, energy supply emissions, transport, industry, buildings, land use sector, as well as non-CO2 emissions. And then we looked in the report what it takes to reduce emissions, different alternative pathways to get to net zero CO2. So there are a few important conclusions that we learn from those alternative pathways. First of all, it has been mentioned already, we need to have reductions across all the sectors, and there are different mitigation strategies possible. But if we want to achieve net zero CO2 emissions, this means that we have to achieve a balance between sources and things. So net zero CO2 does not mean that every activity on this planet needs to be zero. Some emissions will remain in sectors which are difficult to abate, but in order to compensate those emissions, we need to take CO2 out of the atmosphere. So removal of CO2 out of the atmosphere in order to counterbalance those emissions which will remain in sectors which are difficult to abate is unavoidable in order to achieve net zero GHGs. That's one of the, I would say, from the system side, one of the big conclusions, and there is a wide portfolio how to do this. Afforestation, planting trees will take CO2 out of the atmosphere, but there is a range of different technological options as well discussed in the report, like, for example, combining bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, putting the CO2 out of the energy production and putting it underground, or direct air capture, and other options have been discussed in the report, as well as what sort of trade-offs and synergies we might create with basically starting to take CO2 out of the atmosphere. Actually, we are taking already now CO2 out of the atmosphere. Any afforestation is taking CO2 out of the atmosphere. Another main conclusion, perhaps two quick final insights that I thought is important to mention. The pathways the costs of mitigation was a particular focus of the assessment, and very much in line with early assessments, we find that mitigation to stabilize temperatures below 1.5 degrees, the costs of those are relatively modest, in the order of a few percentage points of GDP in 2050. So basically, they are very small mitigation costs. And we find also that there is a cost-effective potential for mitigation available in all the regions. In terms of equity, I don't go into the details here, but chapter 3 particularly has a nice box on equity and poverty implications. One of the major conclusions of the chapter is that basically mitigation actually improves equity when it comes about the differences between per capita emissions of different regions. So generally, mitigation scenarios that achieve stringent climate goals in the future show smaller differences in terms of per capita emissions across different world regions. We have even a pathway which is also a difference to earlier, the so-called sustainable development pathway, which shows somehow how we can shift mitigation or we can shift development in a way that towards sustainability, which could then support mitigation action. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Keywan. Lots to unpack there. Both the decision that the next 8 years are decisive, but also I think the fact that there are a number of pathways through this problem that the scenarios help us understand. And in particular, some of your points about exploring how those scenarios can tell us more about sustainable development being brought together with mitigation, I think are something perhaps we'll come back to in the discussion. Thank you. So let me turn now to Joyshri Roy. Joyshri, would you like to tell us about, in particular, the chapter that you were involved in, but also more broadly than that as well,
Sure.
if you want to expand.
Sure.
Thank you.
I will share my screen. Okay. So what I'm trying to start with is that, as it has been said by everybody, that there are options available now in every sector that can at least halve emissions by 2030. And we all know what are these options. And IPCC report has come up very well with all details that how they can help reducing the emissions with the given target, that how much, if we can halve by 2030, then we can meet the 1.5 degree Celsius stabilization goal. So that's something I would say that it shows the opportunities how we can implement things so that the world can avail the success in mitigation. As I said, they are available in all the sectors, whether energy supply, land use, industry, urban, building, and transport. But also we have possibility of reducing the demand for energy and material by different service provisioning systems. So what I would do is that I would focus on this because I feel that there has been a paradigm shift on the way we think about climate action and reporting of it in IPCC report with its first ever chapter on demand, services, and social aspects of mitigations, which put people at the center and their well-being while mitigating climate change. While assessing the social science literature for this report on what motivates people to take action, it was very clear that people want services to meet their needs for well-being, be it through behavior change or socio-cultural practice change or lifestyle change. So if people are provided with opportunities to make choices and supported by the infrastructure and the access to technology, we see that there is this untapped potential of 40 to 70% by 2050, which can help in bringing down the emissions. So we assessed 60 such actions. Possible, and using electrified transport. So other effective options include reducing air travel and adapting to our more efficient houses and shifting towards balanced plant-based diet, a sustainable, healthy diet as an option. So we present all these options in this figure in the summary for policymaker to show that where how much the potential lies. So if we look into the food and nutrition sector, then we see that sociocultural factors has the largest potential compared to the infrastructure use. And if we look at the industrial sector, land use and buildings, then we see that use of the technology and infrastructure and infrastructure use has very high potential to deliver these changes. So what all this means is that basically if you enable people by providing access to right kind of infrastructure and technology, people can make better choice. So what we have also seen is that all these measures actually help improving well-being as well. And also what we tried to show is that it is the wealthier individuals who have the highest potential for reduction, because we show that 15% of the emission comes from consumption of top 1%, and 48% of emission comes from bottom 90%. So this is in this report, actually, I would say that the IPCC has looked into the inequity in consumption and what can be done, how these can be balanced, as Kevan has also mentioned, that how mitigation leads to more equity issues, makes equity better. So these are the issues which have run through all the chapters in this cycle. And what it also shows is that all these measures actually help in achieving the sustainable development goals, and which are near-term goals. And because if we are going to ramp up our action in these next 8 years, then these are the 8 years when we have to achieve our sustainable development goals also. So it is possible to achieve the sustainable development goal as well as mitigation and human well-being through demand-side measures, and with all the known technologies and what kind of infrastructure design are needed. So if we have more walkable cities, if we have a comfortable and secure public transit system, these really change human behavior and practices, and which help in reduction and getting to 40 to 70% reduction. So what we want to say is that people matters, and wealthier individuals have the highest potential for reduction because they are the investors, they are the consumers, they can be the role models, and they are the professionals. So there is possibility of achieving these through involving inclusive process. What we want to say is that when we look into all these measures in the energy sector, affluent sector, or the building sector, what we see is that globally, options to reduce greenhouse gases by about half of the 2019 level by 2030 are available at a cost less than $100 per ton of CO2 equivalent. And options costing less than $20 per ton of CO2 equivalent make up for more than half of this potential. So that's why what we are saying is that these are cost effective. But remember, when we are talking about these costs, we are not showing the avoided benefit, avoided emission, and the corresponding benefits. Say, for example, benefit coming through air pollution reduction, through better health, through active transport, all these things we are not including. If we include those, then the net cost may be even smaller, which is not assessed in this report though. So, but we have already shown that there are co-benefits in terms of achieving the human well-being and the sustainable development. But the other question which comes up is that where from the money will come. So On that, a report comes very clearly that the financial flows are a factor of 3 to 6 times lower than the levels needed by 2030 to limit warming to below 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius. But the good news is there is sufficient global capital and liquidity to close the investment gaps. However, clear signaling from governments and international community, including stronger alignment of public sector finance and policy, is critically important. The challenge of closing gaps is widest for developing countries. And the report is very clear, as Yuba has already mentioned, that majority of the lower 50% of emitters live in Africa, Southern and Southeast Asia, and Latin America and Caribbean, most without access to electricity or clean cooking services. So there is need for scaled up public grants for low income and vulnerable regions, greater financial flow from developed to developing countries, and public-private cooperation. The lowest population quartile by income worldwide faces shortfall in shelter, mobility, and nutrition, which are the basic constituents of a decent living and also human well-being. There is need for targeted investment in infrastructure access and access to technology so that these services can be provided with modern technology, which requires substantially less energy. And we have shown in Chapter 5 how service provision can be provided with 45% less energy over 2050. So there is enough scope, and all these technologies are known and which can be deployed and which can really make things get realized the potential of 40 to 70%. So the evidence is clear that time for action is now, and we know how to make progress with enough scientific evidences. With these, I'll stop here, and thank you very much, Navroz.
Thank you so much, Joyashree, and again, congratulations on being part of really a path-breaking chapter. As you say, this is the first time the IPCC has had a full chapter on the demand-side potentials, and it's really justified devoting this attention and space to it. Lots of interesting things, and we'll come back to those, I'm sure, in the Q&A. Let me now invite my colleague Parth Bhatia to take a few minutes to discuss findings from the chapter on policies and institutions. And in a sense, it's a nice segue from the previous discussion, because if there is all this sort of potential out there, what is being done to realize that potential? And Parth can start telling us about the answer to that, or some of the answers to those questions, to that question. Parth, please.
Thank you very much, Rose. I'll just quickly share my screen. Okay. Are the slides visible?
Yes, but they're not on projection mode. You need to have it on projection mode. Yes, there you go.
Okay. All right. So thank you so much, Navroz, for your kind words of introduction, and also for giving me the opportunity to be on this panel and present the findings from our chapter, in which you and so many of our other colleagues have poured a lot of their time and effort into. I would also perhaps just take a little bit of leeway and ask you if once I finish the slides, if you'd like to come in and add your own thoughts on our chapter, which I'm sure you have quite a few thoughts. So just quickly turning to the slides, right? So we have the chapter that I'm just going to talk about is chapter 13, which is the chapter on national and subnational policies and institutions. And like Navroz said, this chapter tries to get directly at the heart of what we can do, and particularly what governments at the national and subnational level can do. And while the chapter covers a lot of ground, I'm going to try and focus on 3 key messages, and then maybe one slide on just something that interesting that we see about the nature of policymaking. So the first message that we have is actually about laws. And we find that laws, national laws, subnational laws, targeting climate change and targeting emissions are growing across regions. and they're also growing within countries. And we in India, the audience might not have maybe seen some of these laws, but some of the prominent examples are the UK Climate Change Act. There's an act in South Korea, there's an act in South Africa, and these are really quite important institutions, we find. There are two kinds of laws. One sort of direct laws that really target mitigation explicitly and whose goal is climate change mitigation, and then indirect laws in other fields such as energy, environment, transport, who have indirect impact on the actual emissions outcomes, right? And we find that these are growing across regions, as you can see from the figure. And we also see that there's now direct laws in 56 countries, and this covers more than half of all global emissions in 2020. And this is really quite an important phenomena to understand better, and maybe Navroz could actually talk about the nature of framework laws a bit more. In terms of the evidence of the effectiveness of laws, we find that it's still a bit limited because some of these laws are recent phenomena, but there's a study which has tried to estimate it, and they find that 6 gigatons of carbon dioxide annually have been reduced as an effect of these laws in 2016. And that's a huge number because that's around 10% of the global emissions that we see in this report. So really the upsides of laws are quite significant, but there's also various issues with design and approaches which maybe Navroz can elaborate on. We also find that litigation is growing, and even in developing countries, it's growing. There's a couple of societies that have had climate litigation for a long time, but it's growing everywhere. And there's around 37 cases in 37 countries directly challenging governments to reduce emissions for climate reasons, right? And these are, if these cases sort of make it through, many of them are still in the courts. They could be landmark cases, and they could have quite a significant impact. The second key message that comes out from our chapter is about institutions, as the title says. And we say a lot about institutions, but I'll focus on particularly 3 key functions of institutions. We find that because climate change requires such a massive societal transformation, we need governments to be stronger and more capable at doing tasks that climate change governance would require. And we identified 3 such tasks. First is coordination. This can be across scales, across sectors, and across actors. So coordinating, for example, between the ministry that takes care of agriculture and the ministry that takes care of water and energy could be a role. Coordinating between national governments and local governments and state governments, and particularly in India, federalism is a really quite a rich sort of theme in discussion and in governance, and even actors. So somebody has to shepherd a lot of different actors and get them to move in the same direction, and institutions can play this role. The second sort of role that we identify is in strategy setting. In particular, there's a lot of targets and 2070 net zero targets that India has also adopted. And these long-term targets require long-term action. And somebody has to come and give high quality analysis that can set the strategy, that can inform policymakers and politicians and decision makers, and then find a way of giving a concrete roadmap to reach that target, right? And that I think is very, very critical. We've also seen in literature about net zero that it's not just about the target, but it's actually about how you reach the target and what near-term actions you take to reach the target. It's a strategy setting. And the third is building consensus, which is there's obviously going to be tons of winners and losers, such as people in coal sort of rich areas, people who have interest in fossil fuel companies. And these sort of actors and interests need to be managed, and institutions can actually play that role. They can convene them, they can negotiate with them, they can barter with them, they can play this very, very important role. The third sort of important message from our chapter is on policies, and this is kind of classic IPCC policy stuff. So we find that policies are growing across regions and across sectors. As you can see in the image, nearly in all the climate relevant sectors, policies have grown over time, with agriculture and forestry still being a little bit behind. We also find, and this image doesn't show it, but the emissions trend suggests that these policies are working. What we are doing is working. Carbon taxes, regulatory instruments, other economic instruments, they've all proven to be effective. And this is quite an important message, because a lot of times people ask, why have after so many years, why has the curve not bent? Why have the things that we've done really work? And we sort of have ex post evidence that they are indeed working. We also show that around 20% of global emissions are now covered by carbon taxes or emissions trading systems. And this is quite an important sort of particular type of policies which has received a lot of attention. And emissions trading systems, for example, in North America, in Europe, and in China, we study them in a lot of depth in our chapter. And the final message on policies is that there's still a lot of gap in terms of the coverage and stringency needed in these policies to achieve our goals, right? So, for instance, the levels of carbon prices are still quite low. Non-CO2 gases are not covered. Within sort of the sectors which are covered, there's lots of exceptions and sort of carve-outs. So these things need to expand and they need to scale up. And also, I mean, there's another important message on policies, which is actually about the interactions of policies. So we find that economic instruments and regulatory instruments such as sort of standards and bans and these kinds of things, they've proven to be generally quite effective. And when they're also put together, they are complementary, right? And that actually brings us to an important finding about packages of policies. So lots of governments are now moving to the trend where they don't have a single policy such as a carbon tax, but they're rolling out kind of like an entire portfolio of policies, which we call a package, as it's called in literature. And that's what I'll talk about in the next slide. This slide is, it's a little busy, it's a 4-box, but it actually shows you the evolving landscape of climate policies. I'll just quickly take a second to walk you through this. On the x-axis, you have the outcomes intended from policies. So it could be either enhancing mitigation, or some governments actually have climate policies which also have other development benefits which are part of the goal, such as air pollution, right? And on the y-axis, we have the approach. So either you sort of try to shift incentives, economic incentives in particular, or you try and do some sort of wholesale economic transformation, which the report also talks a lot about, right? And we try and sort of map climate policies on both these axes. And we find that the 4 categories kind of map onto terms which people might be familiar with. So the top right, mitigation and incentives, is things like carbon taxes, which really try and focus directly on mitigation, direct mitigation focus. Sorry, that was the top left. The top right are sort of policies who try and shift incentives, but also have multiple objectives in mind. So things like appliance efficiency standards, right? You want to save energy, but you also want mitigation. Those kinds of things sort of fit into this category. On the bottom left, we sort of try and map what's called socio-technical transitions, or transitions in simple language, such as the policy packages for renewable energy or diffusion, where the goal is often mitigation, and you're trying to get a technology from a low level to a high level. And on the bottom right, you have sort of further, broader, more systemic efforts, which have transitions not just for climate, but also meant for the wider society. So land, energy, water, nexus approaches, green industrial policy, regional just transition plans, these things have a lot of different objectives beyond climate. And we hope that this mapping actually gives you a sense of climate policy broadly. We also find that in previous sort of IPCC reports, the focus was very much on the top left, on direct mitigation. But the interesting shift in recent years has been that the other 3 categories are also seeing a lot of real world examples. And we should keep these things in mind when you think about climate policy making in general. And I think with that, I'm just going to stop and hand it over to Navroz.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Parth. It's a great tour of the work in our chapter. And we've started seeing some questions popping up on the Q&A box. But first, let me just thank all the panelists and just start with maybe a high-level question of my own to get the discussion going. And maybe we'll take sort of 5 or 10 minutes of discussion among and across the panel before opening it up. Listening to this, and it's interesting to be on the in a sense in hearing mode as opposed to trying to generate this information and seeing how this looks to an audience. And I guess we all of us have told stories. All of you have rather told stories about the opportunities that exist. I think K1 was signaling that the trajectory that we're on is not really favorable to get to what is required by science. But there are so many opportunities on the demand side. There are things that are happening at the policy level. And sometimes it comes across a little bit like there's a disconnect a little bit. You know, if there are all these opportunities, and if we and if technology costs are falling, then why exactly is that not being reflected in trends yet? Is it that we are on our way to having it being reflected and there's a lag time? Is it that we have to do more? Are there critical enablers that are not there? So I'd welcome that kind of reflection from anybody in the panel, but maybe I'll kick that off to Yuba with a particular request to also reflect on, you know, whether this story that development and climate can go hand in hand. Is that something that in the LDCs and in particular some of the African nations, that story something that is recognized, and is that something that is accepted, or is it still a contested narrative? So Yuba, can I ask you to come in on this perhaps, and then others?
Thank you. This is very important question, and as in the report and highlighted not maybe more explicitly by my colleagues, there is two important elements. One is, along with mitigation, a deep decrease on emission, we indicated the avoidance of emissions. That's very important. And second element, seeing a decarbonization of increase, it's not a very large scale, but the enhancement of the deployment of renewables with the drastic reduction of the cost of renewable, and associated with also that the much more close link between climate and development, starting with development, and how you make your development much more sustainable, and then how we make it much more compatible with climate, and looking at the different sectors. And then that gives a huge opportunity of the LDCs in particular, or poor countries. If we take any of the sectors, because the LDCs and the African country in general, or the Southeast Asia, are in an early stage of developing their infrastructure. And the option, the wide range of options in those countries much more wider than in industrial or emerging economies. So their energy system can be built completely differently. And then we have seen the continued decrease of the price of renewable, and that could be one element. Aspect related also that we see in the LDCs, in the poor countries, some experience on agroforestry, on land management, on area forestation at very small scale. But if we bring in the energy, in particular the agricultural sector, we take the African countries, 6% of the area are irrigated. With the option that renewable energy offer, there is an opportunity to change completely the nature of agriculture in that sector. And then that gives an opportunity that, and then the third element, just I can have more than to spend the whole time in discussing those. One of the most important elements is that looking at the trend of renewable, particularly the solar, that give a tremendous opportunity of those countries, and then to transition for using charcoal and firewood to electric cooking system, and then with a wider impact on well-being and other. Let me just stop here because we can continue on that. Thank you. Back to you.
Thank you, Yuba. I was particularly struck by the example on the potential for renewable energy to help with irrigation, and that's actually a very important debate here in India as well. We have a question from Professor Kirit Parekh, so I've just requested him to raise his question in person since he's on the call. Professor Parekh, would you like to ask your question? And I think everyone had a response.
The question is very simple in a fact, that Joyshri said that there is enough liquidity available in the international market, which is true. But most of this private liquidity is not available in a long-term, low-interest way. Now, Kaiwan has responded that yes, it is possible to reduce the risk level of this, but I would still like to understand how are we going to finance the kind of needs that we will have. For example, the finance need for India would be almost in the order of $100 billion a year for the next 30 years. Now, where do we going to find it? And there are also issues of stranded assets and people who are losing jobs and how and so on. But I'm glad that you have dealt with many of these things in some ways, though I can understand that you don't go into nationwide or nation-specific policies, which is understandable. But I'm still concerned that where is India going to find this? Yes, renewables are cheap in the long run, but upfront they require a lot more investment than others.
Thank you, Professor Parekh. Would either Joyashree or anyone like to
investment for education?
I know Professor Parekh always asks very, very good question, and we have learned from him all these years. What I would suggest is that I'll give some examples, right? So if we think that, if we just take the macro picture of India and we see how India has been successful in implementing the energy efficiency programs and decouple, achieved relative decoupling of activity growth and energy and emission growth. Many of this was a private investment, then other sources were through cooperation and loans and all. So it was more market driven because that gave market competitiveness to the industries and which led to this. So I think what we need is that kind of creating enabling environment where the return becomes more, return becomes higher so that there is interest from the financial institution also to fund those. So I think there are need for policy changes, but also another angle, let me just say, I was looking into the numbers. So if you look into the post-COVID-19 recovery package globally, it is 12 trillion. And the kind of money is needed for achieving the 1.5 degree goals is much, much less than 12 trillion. So can we see how this recovery money can be invested in these ways? So I think we need to be innovative and try to find out how this can be navigated through. So, and there are opportunities which are low-cost opportunities. So when new cities are being built, how can we build it so that we do not commit to a more emitting structure? And so I think, India has done many things in the past, and there are possibilities of ramping up those.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Joyashree, and thank you also for the question, Professor Parekh. Can I actually pivot to a question that talks about the structural tendencies? So we have a question from Nagaraj Adve saying, in what ways are underlying structural tendencies in the global economy addressed in the report? 3 in particular: growing urbanization, the drive for constant emission growth, and the need for energy security that will ensure that emissions will continue to rise this decade and beyond. So do we have anybody willing to take this on, the larger kind of structural issues? And if there's nobody immediately, I could kick off the beginnings of an answer and others could pick up.
Why don't you go ahead, Navroz?
Okay, all right. I'll just maybe get the ball rolling and others can come in. I think it's a really important question, Naga. And one of the things the report tries to do this time around is it tries to reframe the conversation by saying, and I think this is where Joyshree's answer ended, it reframes the conversation by saying that mitigation isn't only about adoption of low carbon technologies. It's actually about internalizing climate considerations in a whole range of opportunities. And when you do that, it opens up many, many doors to mitigation. I think Yuba gave us an example also with agriculture with agriculture in Africa, and I think it's at 6% of irrigation, and the potential for us to both mitigate as well as enhance livelihoods by bringing renewable energy together with agriculture. But the kinds of examples that Nagaraj gives, right? So growing urbanization, I think, is a very big part of Joyshree's chapter 5. The ways in which you think about urbanization and the opportunities to lock in low carbon growth rather than high carbon growth. So development choices are implicitly climate choices. And the report sort of says, well, maybe we should make them explicitly climate choices. In some cases, we can bring them both together, but also in some cases, there are trade-offs between them, and we should be alive to those trade-offs. So I would like to think the report isn't just very sanguine about the possibility for downsides, which is where the discussion about equity and just transition also comes in. But maybe others would like to add in on this point, and then we can turn to another theme after that. Yuba, Joyshree.
Yeah, just to add, I'm just thinking that there are going to be, say, in India, just a conservative number, 50% of cities are going to be built. So how do we build it? Do we build it with integrated, providing road spaces which are also providing walkability, which is also providing cycling facilities, and so that one can do the intermediate transportation through active transport. And in India, already 42% people walk. So how can we make that more healthy and safe, so that in mega cities we do not implement policies which bans walking and cycling, rather provides infrastructure facility so that it helps in walking and cycling. So I'm just giving one example what can be done. And so there is how we provide the service of water supply at the end user level. So are we providing with the most efficient technology so that the loss in energy and resources are much less, so that the total demand for primary energy reduces? Because people, we have seen in our chapter that people want service and they want to save money, right? So if my energy bill goes down, they immediately take up that. So through efficient provisioning of service, we reduce the demand for energy. So in a way, we are leading people giving a chance to save on their energy bill. And so all literature shows that those are something which society accepts fast. So I think demand side actions provide that possibility of through different policy incentive and infrastructure design and technology, which are anyway going to be provided. So can we take the best available technology? And that's how we can achieve this. I think, there are ample of examples this report provides, and there are many good examples from India also. But just to mention one more, say, for example, how in 4 years' time, whole of access to modern cooking fuel in India was made available through a series of infrastructure choice, through a whole package of policies, and that made it happen. That was, of course, LPG, transition to LPG, but a similar transition to electric cooking is also feasible looking at the past examples. So I think, I mean, these India has done already, and we can just replicate these for scaling up in other sectors.
Thank you. Thank you, Joyshri. I note that there are questions, follow-up questions on the chat that maybe you can also answer. In particular, saying, look, are we letting the rich world off the hook? And more broadly, the question about lifestyle changes as a way of talking about this, and what you think about that framing of lifestyle changes. And we just have a question from Tarun Khanna on whether there are questions about research questions on the demand side. I'm going to come back to you for an answer on those three, but I'm just going to first turn to Kewan to see if he might answer a little bit more. I think he's answered on the chat, but whether he would like to say a little bit more about the role of these particular instruments, these tools, the SSPs and so on, and how you feel they help take the conversation forward, as well as, if you feel comfortable, Kewan, perhaps taking on the questions on nuclear energy and what the report says about that. But I know that wasn't in your chapter, so you can duck that one if you wish.
Yeah, so on the, I will perhaps take on also a little bit the demand side question at the end, but so on the shared socioeconomic pathways, perhaps not all are familiar with them, but it's basically an effort in the community to basically develop so-called shared pathways that can be used by researchers, and which shared means here that make basically combine a certain set of assumptions into 5 different narratives of the future, where basically from sustainability to the other end, focusing a lot on let's say economic growth, and where mitigation and adaptation might be more difficult or less difficult. So in a condensed way, the shared socioeconomic pathways have helped to understand under which conditions in the future emissions might be high or low, and under which conditions actually it might not be possible to meet some of the goals anymore. So this is the first IPCC report that I'm aware of, which has in a summary of policymakers statement about that the 1.5 degree or the 2 degree target is out of reach if you follow the underlying assumption of socioeconomic pathway 3, which is if you have slow technological change combined with high population growth and combined with fragmentation, basically very low levels of collaboration. So those pathways have helped to disentangle different dimensions and factors that make some of these pathways in the long term feasible or not. So I think that was a one big contribution of the SSPs. The other big contribution is, of course, comparability. So if you have hundreds and thousands of different studies in the literature and they all make different assumptions, it is very difficult to disentangle robust insights. But since there are hundreds and thousands of scenarios that are based on different assumptions of these SSPs, we can much more easily compare them and include them in our assessment. So I would say these are the 2 major insights that the SSPs have enabled this time compared to perhaps earlier assessments which didn't have those shared socioeconomic assumptions. I think from the Indian perspective, it is, I think this conclusion on SSP3 is extremely important, because it's a conclusion about that if we live in a world which does not collaborate, and where basically everybody tries to meet climate goals on its own without any financial movements across the regions, it's almost impossible to get to 1.5 degrees. So a lot of the questions in the chat are actually exactly about that dimension, the fragmentation that we see in those scenarios which do not get there. But this is a question that we scientists cannot answer, how collaboration can be enhanced between different regions. I think that's then now I would formulate it differently. Now the report, the scientific insights have been provided. The ball is now in the policy court, right? To implement, to start to accelerate implementation, and also enable collaboration across regions, so that some of those financial bottlenecks can be opened to some extent. Nuclear. This is a very hot topic here in Austria, where I'm coming from. So I got lots of questions about nuclear in the meantime. The assessment is very clear. It's not in my chapter, it's in chapter 6. Basically, the assessment indicates that nuclear is a quite costly option. The costs are regionally very different, but nuclear has two main disadvantages. That it's high capital intensity and relatively high costs of generation, and it's also it takes a lot of time to build a nuclear power plant. And if you combine this, so at the moment, to build a nuclear power plant is around 15 years. And if you remember the introduction that I gave at the beginning, saying that the next 8 years are decisive whether we make it to 1.5 degrees or not, you can see that nuclear generally will come too late if it would scale up as we see it at the moment in the real world. Still, many scenarios include nuclear. In some scenarios, nuclear contributions increase into future, but we have also scenarios in the IPCC which clearly show that we can achieve the targets and at the same time phase out nuclear. So the range of uncertainty of what the role of nuclear would be in the future is relatively wide, for no contribution at all down to an increase in nuclear. And probably I've talked already too much, and I should give Josh the opportunity to respond to the demand side questions, but we might come back to it.
You can take 20 seconds, Kevan, and then we can let Joyce react.
Okay, so I think a really novel aspect of the assessment is this chapter 6, which looks into the demand side solutions. I think from a perspective, this has a number of different important implications. So one is, if you really follow a fundamentally restructured, if you really follow the fundamental restructuring of the demand side sectors in direction of higher services, we actually achieve better quality of future services at lower costs, as well as at lower GHG emissions. What do I mean with lower costs? Usually, this means moving away from a system which is based on own service to a system where services are more shared. So for the individual, the capital intensity and the investment which is needed to buy a car is not there anymore. So the demand side solutions enable a much more democratic access to the service as well. And that, I think, is very important in countries which have a relatively high share of people who are poorer. So this demand side transition means that the capital requirement moves from the individual to the public sector, because you need to move into the infrastructure itself as well. And I think this is a very big advantage of the demand side transition, in addition to the advantage that it's much quicker to change some of the demand side than to rely on large-scale solutions and the supply, which have the inertia, which takes a lot of time until those technologies deploy into the market. And if you don't solve the demand side and be able to basically at least to slow growth of demand, you need to scale up all of these solutions at the supply side. So you have basically a triple benefit from focusing more on the demand side. But Joashi has led the chapter, so I'm just learning from her.
Joyce, before you pick that up, we only have just under 15 minutes left. So I'm going to move into, and we have lots of good questions. So if you want to come in on this on just very briefly, otherwise I'm just going to take on other themes that have come up.
add one thing, and I'll just share the screen again just to show one simple thing which is very important and which can be shown explained very easily, right? So when we talk about that, how much finance is needed. So basically what we do, we see that, okay, so this much of say food sector, how much emission reduction is needed. And then we try to plan, okay, how can I make this an emission reduction in the sector from the supply side, right? So looking into the industry, land transport. So we are talking about how much emission reduction is needed, and then we look into the supply side and we try to see that how much cost is needed. And then we think that, oh my God, how can I get so much of money for renewable, etc., etc. So now my question is, what this chapter is saying that if we work on the demand side technology choice, infrastructure investment. So you are distributing the investment among the different social groups. So you are making development more inclusive. So you are shifting your developmental priorities, and you are looking at people, and you can reduce, I'm just showing, say in the industry sector, you can reduce so much. And so you are taking away the burden on supply sector of this much, and this much which you cannot do by demand side, you leave it out for the supply side. Then you think of bringing in renewable. So, I mean, so that's what I wanted to say. Yeah, sure.
Thanks, Jayashree. So I think we'll move into kind of a rapid fire round, as the quiz show hosts like to say, for the last few minutes, and try and get a bunch more questions in. I was hoping to get people to ask their questions directly, but from a time point of view, I think we might not be able to do that. Let me ask Yuba, if I might, two questions from the rapid fire round. One is, we have an important question from Nitin Desai, who of course is a leading expert here in India, who says, look, in addition, he recognizes the importance of the demand side story, and he's glad that's in the report, but he also talks about the agreement on global institutional development. So maybe, Yuba, you can take on that question, as well as a question that we have got asked about capacity, saying that, look, we may have the technologies, but the capacity differential in different parts of the world is also very substantial. And maybe you could take on both of those just in short answers, if that's possible, Yuba.
Thank you for those questions. It's not easy in a couple of minutes, but I think that the different add-on chapter on this assessment, such as the chapter 6 that has been indicated by Kewan, and chapter also on development pathways, give an opportunity to completely redefine the narrative of climate and development, starting with development on the climate. And particularly if we take let me come back to the development, the demand side approach also. That's very important because of the nature of the renewable energy, particularly the solar, moving from the supply side to the demand side. And then you can target the needs, and then you design your energy system based on the needs rather than a decentralized system as we know. And it's important also what indicated on a capacity issue. It has to do with largely new type of institutions, because as you have seen, climate development are not inseparable. And then in most of the developing countries in particular, we are mimicking the kind of the type of institution that exists in the North, while the approach of the problem, the nature of the problem, the kind of the problem, the solution are completely different. And then we need to have an institutional innovation in order to take on board and those different aspects where we have a clear view and then how to tackle them. But what remains as a fundamental issue is the finance, and then we do not have time to go in detail on that. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Yuba. Parth, there was a question about sort of the relative effectiveness of command and control regulatory mechanisms versus others. Maybe you could just briefly tell us what the report says about that.
Sure. Thanks, Narose. So, yeah, I mean, command and control is typically what we also refer to. In the report we refer to it as regulation, like or regulatory instruments, and there are various classes of regulatory instruments. So the bottom line is that for certain applications and certain sectoral applications, you do need command and control, right? Like certain things need to get banned, for example, particular pollutants or particular gases. And in particular places, you need to set standards. So it's required. It's effective. And the report also says that it tends to enjoy more public support than even things like carbon taxes, even though carbon taxes may be more economically efficient at a macro level, but people tend to be more comfortable with regulations. It's just a cultural factor sort of in various countries, right? So they play a role. And the other thing is that the report finds that over time, the emphasis of policies has shifted away from policies focusing on persuasion and information provision to have more policies that do command and control and more policies that actually price carbon or have other sort of economic instruments. And these instruments have proven to be generally quite effective. So I could tell you the trend, but then beyond that, I feel like I wouldn't want to add words to what the report says.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Parth. I think there was a good and succinct.
You're muted, Navroz. Sorry, you accidentally muted yourself.
Sorry. Thanks so much. Thank you, Parth. That was a good and succinct answer. You know, we have a comment here. We have lots of questions, and I'm struggling to kind of grab them all and do justice to them. We have an interesting question also about net zero goals and how these, including by companies, but they lack interim emission reduction targets or plans to curb indirect emissions. And maybe we can have just a quick reflection on this. What's the credibility of these goal-setting efforts? You know, lots of exhortations. The Secretary General has just set up a committee, a high-level committee to look at net zero goals and so on. So we see more of this goal setting. And what do we think about the credibility of those, and how can those be enhanced? And then while you reply to that, I'm also going to note that I'm going to come back to you for a final round on a very appointed question by Mr. Surya Sethi, who is a very respected senior Indian policymaker, who says, look, if the IPCC has all the answers, which it sounds like you guys do, maybe the issue is just that you're in the wrong roles and you should be the policymakers and we should be switching roles. So you know, it comes back to the question I started with. This all sounds quite rosy, but a lot isn't, but not things aren't happening at the pace required. So any closing remarks on that would also be wonderful. Let me start with Joyshri, then turn to K1, to Parth, and then give Yuba the closing word on this, please.
I think it was, I mean, Dr. Surya Sethi who really started this whole discourse of lifestyle change in IPCC report, and it was fourth assessment report, if I remember. And but what I want to say is that he also knows very well that IPCC scientists can provide evidences and can provide the examples and the analysis. But of course, the decision makers and policy makers, they know the multiple challenges and they are in the real world implementing those, looking into their national context. So from my point of view, the scientist can do the analysis and provide the evidences and information, and so that those information can be taken up as required in the national context by the policymaker to see what suits whom and to what scale.
Okay, thank you, Joyshri. K1.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, your first question was, I think, a really really good one. So to which extent are the goals that we are seeing now also complemented by policies that basically are needed in order to achieve those goals? I think this is a situation which is very different across different countries. So and you know the situation better than me. So in some countries, those targets are actually accompanied by real legislation. It's very often those countries where, for example, within the European Union, that I understand much better than other circumstances, not meeting your targets is a very expensive exercise, because you either need to buy on the market your permits, or you need to pay fines to the European Union. So this is taken very seriously, and we as scientists are more and more asked to provide more practical recommendations also when it comes to policy implementation, which sometimes has advantages and sometimes has disadvantages. Because practical policy making is sometimes a little bit different than understanding the options itself, and policy making is happening in a very wide range of understanding trade-offs and different objectives and etc. But I would say there are a number of countries where we see significant emissions reductions and also binding legislation which is consistent with the net zero target. And then there are a number of countries where I think that the net zero target is a new idea, and there is no real plan there. What makes me personally more hopeful is also that what the Paris Agreement has done is that basically climate policy, even if it's too weak, has become mainstream. And we have seen that the industry sector is jumping on this train, and we see many of the innovations actually coming from the private sector and being even quicker than the policy environment. So if you think about electric vehicles and what happened to their prices, what happened to prices of big batteries, the adoption of in some places, solar energy has become cheaper than any competing fossil fuel. I think these are there are feedback loops that basically can lead to self-reinforcing positive. I don't think that this is enough, yeah. But there are these positive feedback loops as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevan. I'm going to turn to Parth, but before I do that, Kevan, we have a question from Bert Metz in the chat on how it is that since climate sensitivity is higher and global emissions are increasing, how can the net zero be pushed back to the early 50s instead of 2050 as in the 1.5 report? And I think you might just give an answer in the chat to that one, if possible. Parth, do you want to take on Surya's bigger question and have some closing thoughts, and then I'll turn to Yuba.
Yeah, I feel like it's a bit odd for me to comment on these things in response to someone like Surya, who's really seen policy making and planning sort of in a way that none of us probably have. I mean, personally, for me, I think the metaphor of map makers and navigators still rings very true. And potentially the IPCC's role is better as map makers, and then the navigation should be done by politicians who really are connected to the people on the ground in a way that the IPCC report, I think still it's moving in the right direction, but it still may not be right. I think everybody here would acknowledge that with each passing report, the literature is becoming more and more diverse, but then there's still gaps such as non-English language literature maybe not coming in the same way. So those kinds of things I think are still gaps within the IPCC report, and policymakers who can do this navigation and who can negotiate with sort of the people who lose out, they really are the best suited people for this task. That's thank you so much.
Thanks, Parth. And last word to to Yuba Sakona, both on this question as well as the issue of the credibility of net zero targets, given that it's becoming kind of a device, increasingly these voluntary targets.
Okay, just to follow up with part on the map and metaphor, I think that the map provided by IPCC within this 6 assessment cycle, and particularly with the report of Working Group 3, is much more detailed in terms of the option how to address climate change issues. Not only climate taken in isolation, but embedded in sustainable development, and starting with development aspect, making them compatible. And then we see that we have seen in the past focusing, and then that was some of the tension, focusing only on climate and then neglecting development in many developing countries. Now we have seen the close link between the two, the compatibility between the two. We can address the well-being of all the countries, all part of the world, starting where they are, and then to make that much more sustainable and compatible with climate. And we give a number of options for that, up to the policymakers now to take the decision based on that. And then in terms of the credibility of net zero, the feasibility of net zero, there are a number of options. There are a number of elements that is very well documented in the report. Here again, this is on the policymakers and then to make it real. But they have all the menu of the option, the possibility and the perspective on their hand. And in particular, I think that what is very important is for the poor country, the LDC, the least developed country, and then the intermediate country to have a completely new narrative, and then to make their development aspiration compatible with climate goals. And I think that's very important, all the elements as embedded in the report. Back to you, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Yuba. I think that's a really important note on which to end. Whether in fact and I think it's at the heart of Surya Sethi's question as well, whether in fact this new narrative can be created, the IPCC tries to create it, but whether it is a credible narrative and can be picked up and made possible by politicians. And I think that maybe the addition to the question is not just scientists and policymakers, but also politicians who are the ones who actually have to craft and sell this narrative. Before I thank everybody, I'm going to permit myself just 30 seconds of additional comment, and I'm sorry we're running a few minutes over, to make sort of one point. This question about why, if we have so many good ideas and so many opportunities and so many technologies, why the trend isn't changing as fast as it is, I think it's my own feeling is that it's partly, this is a big ship to turn around and there is a lag. But we see evidence that turning is happening. But beyond that, I think we focus too much on the technologies and the policies, but not enough on the politics of how they get implemented. And therefore, I think that one of the things that I would like to just, take the privilege of being with this last word to flag is that what we say in chapter 13 is that it is really important to build a climate-ready state. We don't use those words because they're a bit dramatic for an IPCC report. But if you have these policies out there and you have potential winners and potential losers, and you have long-term strategies, you can't do this without a more capable state. And so state capacity is really important. It's not, of course, just going to be the state, but it's the state enabling communities, the private sector, academics, and building dedicated knowledge institutions. We can maybe learn from the UK on this, building dedicated deliberative institutions. We can learn from South Africa on this, building coordination bodies, and we can learn from a number of countries on this. So that kind of mobilizing and harnessing to convert the potential into implementation, I think we haven't made enough progress there. Most countries in the world are governing climate as if it is any other issue. It isn't any other issue. The complexities are of an order of magnitude greater, and we don't have a governance structure that is capable of handling that complexity at the moment in all but very, very few countries. And so perhaps I offer that is an area that is ripe for further thinking and research. And I hope you don't mind me indulging in this little bit of pontificating and taking advantage of my position at the end of this conversation. It just remains for me to thank, well, first of all the participants, and my apologies to the audience, those of you who didn't have your questions answered. I know K1 in particular has been very diligent answering questions on the chat, so thank you, K1. Thank you to my colleagues here at CPR, particularly Mandakini Chandra and Parth as well, who've helped organize this. Thank you very much to the panelists, to Joyshri, Parth, K1, and Yuba. This has been a really great conversation. Thank you all for joining, and have a good evening, morning, or afternoon, whichever part of the world you're in. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Navroz.
Rose.
And your team. Thank you.
Yeah, what an interactive, great discussion. So many comments. We didn't even respond 10%. See you.
Thank you.